Hi, everybody. Welcome to our lecture on metabolism today. We are going to go ahead and get started with the main purpose of metabolism. The main reason we will have to do this is to basically produce ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. Uh, and that is basically our main molecule, which is used by your cell as a source of fuel. So what can we do with this ATP? ATP is essential for us to be able to maintain our homeostasis process, which basically meant the internal environment can stay consistent regardless of the changes that may happen outside. It also helps in terms of cell functions, such as growth of the cell, cell division, which was basically mitosis and meiosis. It helps break down and replace the components of the cell that might have been worn out and needs to be replaced. It helps with processes such as muscle contraction, a spreading of the electrical impulse, such as action potential, associated with both your neurons as well as your muscles. It helps you carry out the process such as secretion. For instance, secretion of digestive juices from your pancreas. And of course, it helps you basically store energy for later on if you are required to basically do an activity without actually consuming any food. Then you will have that extra storage of energy inside your body that can be converted to ATP for use. So let's go ahead and take a look at the two main processes or reactions associated with metabolism. The first one is known as catabolism. So catabolism is when you take a large molecule and break it down to smaller components. And those eventually can be used to synthesize your molecules of ATP or other high energy molecules, which we really are not going to get into for this class. Now, opposite of catabolism is anabolism. Anabolism is when you take smaller molecules and you combine them to form a large new molecule from that. Now, if it's not really making sense right now, let's take a look at a quick picture. So here is a picture of the three main food groups that we have. Triglycerides, which are basically your fat, glycogen, which is a main category of your carbohydrates, and proteins, which are basically any source of meat or legumes that you may consume. So notice that there are these gray arrows that are going between these boxes. Now, I can take a typical fat. Oh, sorry, guys. I can take a typical fat, which is triglyceride, and go through the process of catabolism, break it down to fatty acid, and then send that fatty acid eventually into my structure called mitochondria, and out of that comes ATP. I can take glycogen, which is a form of carbohydrate, or a complex carbohydrate, and break it down to simple sugar through the process of catabolism, and eventually again go through the mitochondria and produce ATP. Same process can be repeated for your proteins, broken down to amino acids, and getting introduced into the mitochondria, and eventually lead to production of your ATP. Now, what is anabolism then? What's the opposite of that? That's the upward arrow that you see here. So I can take fatty acid as well as glycerol, which is not listed here, and combine them to form my triglyceride molecules and store that fat eventually for later use. If I have extra glucose in my bloodstream, I can introduce insulin into my bloodstream and combine these individual glucose molecules to form a larger complex carbs called glycogen. I can also take individual amino acids and connect them together using your covalent bonds and make new proteins that my body needs. So putting these reactions that I've described so far for you together, that describes the process of metabolism. So let's look at it in another way. Why do we need ATP? What is the purpose of ATP? So we have a really good analogy here where you have basically, you have gold at the beginning. Gold cannot be consumed on its own. So what we do is we convert that to basically money. And money can be used for us to, let's say, purchase your coffee. So if you want to use the same analogy here, we are going to consume an apple. So the apple is equal to gold. But I cannot just take that apple. So what I would do with that apple is I will convert it to a form of energy my cell can use. And that energy is basically, again, as I said, is adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP. And that ATP is the one that is going to give you the capacity to do actions or work inside your cells. What are some of those actions? They allow your enzyme to do their job. They allow muscle contraction to happen. They also allow membrane proteins to move things using the process known as active transport. Now, if you guys don't recall active transport, you can go back to your cell lecture at the beginning of the semester, where we have talked about membrane transport in detail, categorizing them to passive and active. Now, let's take a closer look at our process. When again, we're looking at the food, and this is again going back to our earlier lecture in the semester, we talked about three main food groups. These groups were your carbohydrates or carbs, they were your proteins, and they were your fats or your lipids. Technically, there is a fourth organic macromolecule that we discussed, which is nucleic acid, your DNA and your RNA, which is broken down to nucleotides. But technically, your body does not use nucleic acid as a source of energy. Rather, it uses it as a way to store genetic information for later generations. So again, kind of reminding you in a different way, in a different picture, carbs that are these large molecules like the veggies that you have in this plate, your tomato, your lettuce, bread, potato, starch, anything that you have that is identified as carbs can be broken down to simple sugar. And notice the amount of calories that you can get for each of these is relatively small. So simple sugars are necessarily not known for the amount of energy they provide for you. So it's about 4 calories per gram of carbs that you consume. Another group of macromolecules that we have here is your proteins. Now again, we describe protein as these large macromolecules that break down to amino acids, which are these little individual green structures you see. And as you can see again, we're not really getting as much energy in terms of calories when you consume proteins. So 4 calories per gram, which is almost the same as what you will get from consuming carbs. Fat, on the other hand, are the things basically you will have in, let's say, basically oil, butter, anything that has trans fat in it in terms of fried food. When you consume those, they get broken down to fatty acid, which are these little yellow blobs, and these little lines that you see, which are your glycerol. Now look at the number, guys. For every gram of fat you consume, you can earn 9 calories of energy for that. So basically what we're saying here is the amount of energy produced by carbohydrates and your proteins per gram of consumption is definitely much less than what you will get for consuming 1 gram of fat. So that's why when you go on a diet, especially if these are high protein, high carb diets, they kind of push those carbohydrates and proteins on you, healthy ones in terms of carbohydrates, and tell you to stay away from fat. Now, all of these food groups that we described, your simple sugar, amino acid, your fatty acid, and glycerol, these are broken down within your digestive system and then get introduced into your bloodstream. So you basically eat your carbs, your proteins, and your fat. Your digestive system breaks them down, and they get absorbed as sugar, like glucose, amino acids, and fatty acid and glycerol. So now that we have these small molecules of food inside our body, what can we do to get it to become ATP? So for that, we're looking at the process described here. So let me kind of break down the image for you if it's hard to follow. Right here, we have a typical animal cell. So you can see your plasma membrane in yellow. Inside of the cell, what is visualized here, you have your nucleus. And this structure, that's this double membrane structure, which is your mitochondria. Couple of notes about your mitochondria. Mitochondria has 2 membranes, an inner membrane that is folded, and you can see it right here, and an outer membrane, which is basically the one that sits outside. Having this double membrane within your mitochondria is essential for its capacity to produce ATP. Now, I don't go into detail for your class, but there is a little bit of a discussion about how it does that in later slides. So what we have here in this picture is we're bringing 2 essential components into my cell. Those are typically glucose as the main source of energy for your cells, and then oxygen gas, which is depicted right here as these blue circles, are being transported by your blood vessels or by your bloodstream, and then eventually get into your cell. Now, your mitochondria will effectively use both these oxygen and glucose, and through multiple processes, produce the following items. ATP, which is again the main source of energy in terms of your carrying the process of functions within your cell. You have a byproduct, which is water. And you have a byproduct, which is our waste gas, carbon dioxide. Now notice that water typically remains inside the cell. ATP stays inside the cell and is used to carry out the functions. And CO2, which is a waste product, is returned back to your bloodstream and eventually exhaled out through your lungs. So if you guys kind of go back and tie everything we're describing here, now I have brought in both your circulatory system by introducing the blood vessel, as well as your respiratory system that allows the gas exchange and bringing your oxygen in and taking out the carbon dioxide. So here is a beautiful way of depicting our main process of producing energy from our food. Again, we pick glucose because that is the main source of energy for us. I do require you to know what is the actual equation for glucose. It's C6H12O6, which basically means you have 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, and 6 oxygen. You have an O2 molecule, so 2 oxygen atoms combined together. And the output of this process is ATP, and I'll tell you how many exactly later on. Carbon dioxide, which is also CO2, and then water, which is your H2O. So we're talking about producing energy. The first thing I want you guys to understand is, because this process that I'm describing right now requires oxygen input, so that O2 molecule that comes in through your blood vessels. Because of that requirement, this reaction is known as aerobic reaction. So aerobic reaction is basically a series of reactions that requires oxygen, and through that process you produce ATP, which is basically what I've described to you so far. There is a second type of reaction, and I'll describe that later on, called anaerobic reaction. And that takes place when there is no oxygen present in our environment. So your cells will be relying on a process called fermentation to basically produce and continue recycling, so your body can produce very little ATP. Now, what are the steps that allows the aerobic reaction to produce energy for us, to produce and create that ATP for us? There are 3 steps involved in this process. First one is called glycolysis. Second process is called citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. And the third step is electron transport chain, sometimes simplified to ETC. Now, these are very complex processes. If you have ever going to take a biochemistry class, they go into a lot more detail than what we're going to do. Here, all we're doing right now is introducing the vocabulary. So let's go ahead and take a look at each of these 3 stages or steps involved in the aerobic process. So the first step is glycolysis. Now, where does the glycolysis process take place? Glycolysis takes place within the cytoplasm of your cell. So if you guys recall, the cell, the space inside the cell is your cytoplasm, and that's the space basically where you have your organelles located. So what do we actually get as we carry out the process of glycolysis? So glycolysis always starts with a 6-carbon glucose, which is basically the C6 that I mentioned earlier. Now, during this process, you're going to produce 2 ATP. So as you're going through this process of glycolysis, you're going to produce 2 ATP, and you're also going to produce a final product called pyruvate. So I just want to take a quick second and do a quick drawing for you guys. So here is a typical, and again, simplified version of a glucose molecule. So imagine each of these circles that I'm drawing are representation of a carbon. So this is a 6-carbon molecule, and the 6-carbon molecule basically going to represent my glucose, which is what we show right here. Now, as it undergoes through the process of glycolysis, what I'm actually going to do, and again, this is simplified version, this is not what actually happens, but we're gonna simplify it to say, we're gonna take this glucose and break it down right in the middle, and I'm gonna get 2 3-carbon molecules, so that's 1, and that's our second one. And each of these are now going to be referred to as what? Your pyruvate. So you take a 6-carbon, which you usually shorthand it to 6C, to form what? two 3-carbon molecule, which are pyruvate. Now again, during this process, I am also going to produce what? 2 ATP. And something that is not listed, but it will come back to us when we talk about fermentation. We also produce these high energy molecules. And these high energy molecules are referred to as NADH. They are responsible for carrying electrons. And again, it will make a little bit more sense as we go through it, but I'm not really diving into detail about this. So the next step within our aerobic process or aerobic respiration process is citric acid cycle. Now, again, as I mentioned, there is a secondary name for it. You can refer to it as the Krebs cycle. So this is basically the cycle that is depicted here. So notice these electrons or E negatives that they basically have. These are E negatives. These are basically the ones that are high energy electron carriers, the one I mentioned before. So, these electrons get picked up by your high energy electron carriers. So imagine this, guys. NAD plus, which is my high energy electron carrier. When it has that plus right here, it means that it hasn't picked up anything. Think about it as an empty taxi, okay? Now, as soon as it picks up this high energy electron, then NAD plus becomes NADH. So as soon as it picks up its electron, it becomes NADH. When it drops off its electron, it becomes NAD plus. When it picks up an electron, it becomes NADH. So what do we accomplish by going through the citric acid cycle? So citric acid cycle produces a little bit of energy, which is about 2 ATPs. It also produces number of these high energy electron carriers, or basically pack your taxis. So produce a bunch of NADH, which are depicted right here as your trucks. These green stuff you see right here. And you are also going to produce what we identified as your waste gas, which is your CO2. So if I ask you what is happening in Krebs cycle, you should be able to list the following. First, we're bringing the pyruvate in, right? And by using the pyruvate and whatever it is within this cycle, I'm going to produce NADH, which are my electron carriers. I am going to produce very little ATP, which is about 2 ATPs. And I'm also producing my waste gas, which is CO2. So now I have these electron carriers, NADH. They are going to be destined for the next part of this process, which is your electron transport chain. So look at the keyword here, guys. The keyword here is electron. So what this electron transport chain is, first of all, where is it located? Remember when we were talking about the mitochondria, we talked about that folded inner membrane? That's where this electron transport chain takes place, in that folded inner membrane you see right here. So what they're going to do is they're going to take the electrons that were carried by your NADH. So at this stage, basically, your NADH, which are your carriers, your trucks, your taxis, are going to drop off their electrons and become what again? NAD plus. Now, these electrons undergo quite a few reactions involving number of proteins, including a protein called ATP synthase. We don't need to know the name. But here is what is exactly happening in terms of the overview of the electron transport chain. Electrons come in, and with the use of the energy from those electron carriers, we produce a significant amount of ATP, which is 36 ATPs. We also bring in the oxygen now, the oxygen that we brought in, and that oxygen is going to get used during the process and produce the byproduct H2O, or water, that is basically, again, one of the end products of the aerobic respiration or electron transport chain. So if I ask you guys, within these three processes, which one is the most important in terms of the amount of ATP they produce, your answer should be electron transport chain, because they produce 36 ATPs within the process. Both your glycolysis as well as the citric acid cycle are not known for the amount of ATP they produce. As you can see, they each produce only 2 ATPs. Rather, they're known for producing your high energy electron carriers, which are your NADH, and they are the ones that go into your electron transport chain and are used to produce all of that 36 ATPs. So typically when we're talking about ATP, when you're talking about ATP production throughout the process of aerobic respiration, we usually say the amount of ATP is between 36 to 38 ATP total, or net production is 36 to 38 ATPs. And the main reason for that is that some of these ATP can be used as this process is happening. So it's not all production of the ATP. You still need to give some ATP to allow this reaction to take place. So typically, if I ask you how much ATP can you get from one glucose molecule, the answer is between 36 ATP and 38 ATPs. Now, next question. There are scenarios where your body may have used so much oxygen that the amount of oxygen that is coming in is not equal to the amount of oxygen your body is utilizing. Really good example is when you're exercising intensely, and because your muscles use so much energy, they require significantly high levels of ATP, and therefore they use a lot of oxygen. So what if the oxygen becomes scarce in your tissue or in your cell? In such a case, your electron transport chain, which produce those 36 ATPs, will shut down. Because if I go back and show you the earlier picture, notice that I said, if I want to produce this 36 ATP, what I need to bring in is what? Your oxygen, right? Oxygen needs to come in for those 36 ATPs to be produced. So if the oxygen is absent or the oxygen is limited, you're basically shutting down the electron transport chain. So in that scenario, your body is going to rely on a process called anaerobic reaction. Anaerobic reaction is where you rely on a process called fermentation to produce and basically produce ATP, but at a very low level. And I'll show you a picture here. So notice right here, you have the same scenario I described before for you. We have glucose in my bloodstream that gets into the cell. But what is missing from this picture is the oxygen that is supposed to be in the bloodstream. And clearly, oxygen is not present here. So what is happening is your cell is undergoing only the first stage of metabolism, which was glycolysis. So here is the glucose, and the glucose is producing pyruvate. Now here's the thing, guys. For the glucose to continue being converted to pyruvate through the process of glycolysis, what I do need is NADH to drop off its electrons, and then I can pick up the new electrons. So it needs to have a cycle, basically. So glucose, to get converted to pyruvate, needs NAD+. Why does it need the NAD+? Because it wants to give it electrons, so it becomes NADH. So here's the thing, guys. Do you have unlimited NAD+ in your system? And the answer is no. Let me just give you an example. So let's say you have 1,000 NAD pluses in your cell. And again, the number is much higher, but these are arbitrary numbers. So I have started to convert glucose to pyruvate in the absence of oxygen. And every time I do this conversion, I'm gonna do what? Convert these NAD pluses to what? To NADH. So as this process happening and happening and happening, what happens to the level of NAD+? It drops, right? You're using them up. What happens to the levels of NADH? They go up. So what's the bad thing about it? Why is this a problem? The problem is this. If I want the glucose conversion to pyruvate to continue happening so I can get this 2 ATP, I need lots and lots of what? NAD+. I don't need NADH. I don't need full trucks. I want those trucks to dump their whatever they have and come back and pick up more electrons. So what can I do? I can use a process called fermentation reaction. So fermentation reaction is what you see here. Again, it's a very complicated reaction. We're not going to go into detail about that. All you need to know is the following. Pyruvate, which is my product of glycolysis, undergoes the process of fermentation and produce either lactic acid or alcohol. Lactic acid actually produced in human, and alcohol is produced in your bacteria. So we don't produce alcohol in our body, we produce lactic acid. So I produce these lactic acid, but the main thing that is happening is that that fermentation process allows me to release or dump off my NADH electrons and become NAD+. So that NAD+ now can go back to this process, allow the glucose to go to pyruvate and produce those 2 ATPs. So if I ask you guys, and this is really important, guys, if I ask you, in the absence of oxygen, or in scenarios where the oxygen is scarce, what is the purpose of glycolysis? The purpose of glycolysis is to produce 2 ATPs. So purpose of glycolysis in an anaerobic reaction is to produce 2 ATPs. If I ask you, what is the job of our fermentation process? Is to recycle NADH to NAD+, so the process of glycolysis can continue to happen. So the purpose of fermentation, I'm going to say it one more time. The purpose of fermentation is the recycling of NADH to NAD+, And as a result, you can continue the process of glycolysis. Lactic acid, interestingly, is one of the reasons you may actually feel that burning sensation if you haven't worked out for a while and now you're starting to work out. And after, when you kind of your body cools down, you start to feel that pain in your muscle. One of the reasons is because you have built up of lactic acid in your system. I like this picture that kind of gives you that overview of what is happening in an anaerobic reaction versus an aerobic reaction. So you have the glucose, which undergoes the process of glycolysis, and glycolysis produces the 2-pyruvates. This process also produces 2 ATP on the side. If you do have oxygen, which is most of the cases, you are going to rely on the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, and production of ATP. You can ignore these numbers. I'm not going to go into details where these numbers come from. So your number was 36 up to 38. If you have no oxygen or your oxygen is scarce, then you're undergoing the process of fermentation where you either produce lactic acid or ethanol, and you recycle your NADH back to NAD plus, so your glycolysis process can continue. Now, what does your body do if you have excess of calories? So, first source for your body, if you have excess of glucose, is to store it as glycogen. So hopefully everybody knows and remembers what glycogen is now. Glycogen is basically the complex carbohydrate, which is basically chains of glucose molecules connected together. The main location for the storage of glycogen are your muscles, skeletal muscles, as well as your liver. Again, reminder guys, glycogen production depends on the insulin in your bloodstream. So when you have insulin in your bloodstream, extra glucose gets taken into your muscle cells and your liver cells and gets converted to glycogen. Now, it is inside your body, you have limited storage space for glycogen. So what if you consume even more calories than your glycogen storage have capacity? In such a scenario, your body is going to take that extra sugar and convert it to fatty acid and glycerol and combine those together to form the common type of fat we know as triglycerides. Now, triglycerides are used for long-term storage, and they basically get stored as fat cells within your adipocytes. Now, one quick note, which I think is very clear from the picture. If you consume extra sugar, it becomes fat. If you consume extra fat, it becomes fat. If you consume extra amino acid, which are basically proteins, it becomes fat. I had an interesting conversation once with an individual, and they asked me, well, I have been consuming a significant amount of protein powder and protein shakes, but I have gained weight, but I haven't been able to build any muscles. And my immediate question for that individual was, are you going to do resistance training while you're eating these proteins? And the answer was no. So think about it. The reason you consume proteins at high amounts and the reason you consume protein as high amount is because you want to build muscle by doing things like resistance training. So resistance training basically put pressure on your muscles. So your muscle says, okay, I'm working out, I need to get bigger. Where can I get my food? The food can come from the protein shakes or the protein powders that you've been consuming. However, if you don't go to the gym, so you're sitting on a couch and you're eating protein shake or gulping down, protein powders or protein shake or protein bars, your body says, you're not doing anything with your muscle. I don't need to use that energy this instant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to store it as fat. So be cautious. If you're going on a diet, make sure that, especially if it's high in protein, that you still need to exercise because otherwise those proteins just get converted to fat. I'm going to skip this slide for you, or I'm not going to skip it, I should say. I will go into a little bit detail about this. The only thing I want you guys to really know about this slide is going back to that whole idea of fermentation I was mentioning earlier. So we said that the final product within the process of fermentation for us was lactic acid, which is also known as lactate. Now, eventually, if you are in a situation where you had a scarcity of oxygen, you will eventually get that oxygen back into your system. But what are you going to do with all of that lactic acid that was built up in the absence of oxygen? For that, we rely on a process called the Cori cycle. Now, Cori cycle is pretty cool. So what it does, it takes the lactate, which is the same thing as the lactic acid, converts it back to the pyruvate, which was the byproduct of the glycolysis, and then eventually convert it completely back to the original glucose molecule, which is pretty awesome if you think about it, guys. So your body used glucose in the absence of oxygen and produced the byproduct called lactic or lactic acid. When your body has enough oxygen, it's going to take that lactic acid or lactate, return it back to pyruvate, and then to the original form, which was the glucose. So your body doesn't really throw anything away. It always keeps it for later use. It's an amazing recycler. Now, a couple of last points that I want to talk about is, it's something I mentioned, it has come up multiple times so far, but just kind of putting it in perspective one more time. The main source of energy for your body is carbohydrates, which are basically your simple sugar. Energy comes from potato, starch, rice, bread, your vegetables, all of these, your fruits, all of these are considered carbohydrates. Now, if your carbohydrate is running low, then your body relies on the second source of nutrients, which are fat. So fat is basically the most common type of fat you have in your body is triglyceride. It is stored in your adipocytes, which are basically your fat cells. And they are going to be more than twice as much ATP compared to when you burn carbs or proteins. When we basically gone through all of our fat and we don't have any additional fat deposit, the final resort would be tapping into your protein supply, breaking down your protein to amino acids, and using that for your source of energy. So the reason I talk about this is because the last concept I want to talk to you guys is the 3 phases of a starvation. So phase 1 is typically only a few hours. So when, for instance, you have to do a blood test or a fasting blood test in the morning, and they tell you not to eat between, I don't know, depend on whoever you talk to, between 8 to 12 hours. So during that time, you're basically going to tap into the storage of glycogen that you have in your bloodstream. Sorry, you have in your body. That glycogen gets broken down to simple glucose and used as a main source of energy. But when you're tapped out in your glycogen storage, then the second phase of starvation starts, where you start to use your fats, your triglyceride, as the primary source of energy. Now, depending on your fat storage, this can last for several weeks. However, if the starvation persists, your body goes into phase 3, which is basically tapping into proteins as the main source of energy. So it starts to break down your muscles. So you can see a significant decline in your protein or your muscle mass if people are in this phase of starvation. And unfortunately, many people will die if they are in this phase, not as a result of a starvation, rather as a result of infections, secondary infections. Because by this stage, your immune system is extremely weak, and consequently, you are much more susceptible to infections, what we identify as secondary infections. Typically, your body can easily deal with these secondary infections if you are a healthy individual. However, a person that has been starved for many weeks, they have an extremely suppressed immune system, and consequently, those infections can cause havoc on the system and lead to death. Okay, so that's about it for our metabolism lecture. Thank you, guys.